I spent years memorizing license plate patterns as a hobby. It ended up solving my neighbor's murder. The police thought I was insane when I told them the killer's vehicle had a fraudulent plate, but I knew I was right because I'd spent 8 years documenting every license plate pattern in the tri-state area. My name is Lauren Vance, and people have called my hobby everything from quirky to pathological, but nobody could argue with the results when Mrs. Portman's murderer was identified through a registration number I'd recognized from my notebooks. It started in college when I developed this compulsive need to find patterns in chaos, probably some undiagnosed anxiety disorder that my parents couldn't afford to have properly evaluated. I'd sit in parking lots and catalog plate numbers, noticing how certain letter combinations appeared more frequently in specific counties, how the state DMV algorithms generated sequential registrations, how commercial plates followed different patterns than personal vehicles. My roommates thought it was weird but harmless until I started filling notebooks with data instead of doing my coursework. I failed out of engineering school because I was spending 40 hours a week tracking plates instead of attending classes. My boyfriend Ryan left me after 2 years saying he couldn't build a future with someone obsessed with something so meaningless. He'd found my database of over 50,000 plate numbers and asked what the point was, what I thought I'd accomplish with this information. I couldn't give him an answer that made sense. My parents stopped asking about my life after the third Thanksgiving, where I'd explained my latest discoveries about California's registration system instead of discussing job prospects or normal hobbies. I was working security at a mall, barely making rent on a studio apartment, and spending every spare moment either photographing plates or analyzing patterns in my growing database. I knew it looked pathological from the outside, this 32-year-old woman with boxes of notebooks filled with license plate numbers and state-by-state breakdowns of registration formats. But there was something meditative about the process of cataloging and cross-referencing, finding the hidden structures in what most people saw as random combinations of letters and numbers. I could identify the state and often the county of issue just by looking at a plate's format. I knew which number ranges corresponded to which registration periods, could spot fraudulent or altered plates instantly because they violated the patterns I'd internalized. Friends from college had stopped inviting me to gatherings after I'd spent an entire party discussing the statistical probability of certain letter combinations appearing in Maryland plates. My brother told me I needed professional help, that this obsession was destroying my ability to function in normal society. He was probably right, but I couldn't stop. The patterns made sense in a way that human relationships never did. Each plate told a story if you knew how to read it, when it was issued, where the owner likely lived, whether the registration was current or expired, whether the format matched legitimate state systems or indicated fraud. Mrs. Portman lived in the apartment below mine in a converted house in suburban Philadelphia. She was 73 years old, a retired librarian who'd lost her husband 5 years ago and had no children. She was kind to me in a way most people weren't, never mocking my hobby or treating me as though I was broken. Sometimes she'd ask about my latest discoveries and actually listen when I explained the nuances of how Pennsylvania restructured their commercial plate numbering in 2019. She'd bring me soup when I was sick and I'd help her carry groceries up the stairs. We weren't close exactly, but there was a comfortable neighborliness between us that I valued more than I'd realized until she was gone. She'd told me once that her late husband had collected stamps obsessively, that she understood how pattern-based hobbies could be soothing for certain types of minds. She never used words like obsessive or pathological, just acknowledged that different people found comfort in different things. That acceptance meant more to me than she probably knew. On a Friday morning in October, I left for my security shift at 6 a.m. and saw Mrs. Portman's door slightly ajar. I called her name but got no response, felt that instinctive concern that something was wrong. I pushed the door open and found her on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood, her head showing obvious trauma from what looked like blunt force. I called 911 immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The paramedics confirmed what I already knew. She was dead, probably had been for several hours based on the blood coagulation. The police arrived and began treating the scene as a homicide. Detective Raymond Chu questioned me extensively about my relationship with Mrs. Portman, my whereabouts the previous evening, whether I'd heard anything unusual. I told him I'd been home all evening working on my database and had worn headphones, hadn't heard any disturbance from the apartment below. He asked about the database and I explained my license plate hobby, watching his expression shift to skepticism when I described the scope of my collection. He asked if I'd noticed any suspicious vehicles in the area recently, and I told him yes, actually I had. There had been a dark blue sedan with New Jersey plates parked on our street 3 times in the past week, always late evening, which was unusual because we didn't have many out-of-state visitors, and the car didn't belong to any resident I recognized. The plate number was NJK 7289, and I'd noted it in my records because it violated the standard New Jersey passenger vehicle pattern. Detective Chu wrote this down, but I could tell he thought I was either unusually observant or suspiciously involved. He asked how I could be certain about the plate number, and I explained that I photographed every vehicle I documented, that I had images and timestamps for the sedan's appearances. The other officers were processing the crime scene, taking photographs, dusting for prints, collecting evidence. One of them made a comment about my security uniform, asking if I'd touched anything in the apartment. I said no, that I'd recognized she was dead and had waited outside for the paramedics. Detective Chu asked to see my hands, and I showed him. No blood or defensive wounds, nothing connecting me physically to the crime. I showed him my phone with the photographs clearly showing the vehicle and plate on Monday evening at 9:43 p.m., Wednesday at 10:17 p.m., and Thursday at 9:55 p.m. Detective Chu seemed more interested now and asked me to send him the images. He said they'd investigate the registered owner but warned me not to interfere with the investigation or discuss the case with anyone. The apartment building's landlord arrived and stood in the hallway looking shaken, asking what had happened. Detective Chu pulled him aside for questioning while I stood uselessly near the stairwell, unable to process what I'd seen. Mrs. Portman had been alive less than 12 hours ago. I'd heard her moving around her apartment the previous evening around 10 p.m., the familiar sounds of her preparing for bed filtering up through the floorboards. And now she was dead, murdered in her own kitchen by someone who'd beaten her hard enough to crack her skull. The senselessness of it made me physically ill. Over the next 2 days, I couldn't focus on anything except Mrs. Portman's murder. I kept replaying that morning, finding her body, the waste of a kind woman's life. The police hadn't released much information publicly, just that they were investigating a suspicious death. But I couldn't let it go, kept thinking about that New Jersey plate and why it had bothered me when I first documented it. On Sunday afternoon, I pulled out my New Jersey registration analysis notebooks and confirmed what had been nagging at me. The plate NJK 7289 shouldn't exist in the current registration system. New Jersey had moved away from that letter number format in their passenger vehicle plates years ago. Current Jersey plates used a different structure entirely. This plate was either very old, which would be unusual on a newer sedan, or it was fraudulent. I called Detective Chu and explained this to him, trying to keep my voice steady and professional despite my excitement at the discovery. He listened without interrupting and then said something that made my stomach drop. He said the plate had been run through the system and came back registered to a 2018 Toyota Camry owned by a woman in Newark who reported it stolen 3 months ago. The vehicle had never been recovered and the registered owner had no connection to Philadelphia or Mrs. Portman. Detective Chu said this likely meant the killer had been using stolen plates to avoid identification, which was smart but not unusual for premeditated crimes. He thanked me for the information but said from here the investigation would be handled by professionals, and I should let them do their job. His tone suggested he was humoring me, that my hobby had provided a small piece of information but nothing that would actually solve the case. I asked if they'd found any other leads and he said he couldn't discuss an active investigation, then ended the call politely but firmly. I sat in my apartment feeling frustrated and useless. My 8 years of obsessive pattern documentation reduced to one minor detail in a case that seemed to be going nowhere. But I couldn't stop thinking about that plate. The fact that it was fraudulent wasn't surprising, but the specific format bothered me. Why use an outdated New Jersey pattern instead of replicating a current one? It would be easier to blend in with a plate that matched the contemporary system. Unless the person creating the fraudulent plate didn't know the system had changed. Unless they'd based their forgery on older information or templates. I started going through my database looking for other plates that violated current state patterns, focusing on the Philadelphia area over the past 6 months. It took me 12 hours of cross-referencing my photographs and notes, but I found 7 other vehicles with outdated or incorrect plate formats. 3 of them appeared multiple times in my records, suggesting they were being used regularly rather than being one-time appearances. I mapped their locations and times, looking for patterns in where these fraudulent plates appeared. 4 of the 7 had been photographed near commercial areas, specifically near car rental agencies and used car dealerships. This suggested a possible pattern. Someone was creating fraudulent plates for vehicles involved in either rental fraud or illegal sales. I called Detective Chu again on Monday morning and explained what I'd found, offering to share my complete analysis. He sounded tired and annoyed, said that while he appreciated my enthusiasm, the investigation was pursuing multiple leads and they had actual forensic evidence they were processing. He said my theory about rental fraud was interesting, but didn't have any obvious connection to Mrs. Portman's murder. I asked what connection there could possibly be between a retired librarian and criminal vehicle fraud, and he said that was exactly his point. There probably wasn't one, and I needed to let the professionals handle this instead of constructing elaborate theories based on my hobby. I felt dismissed and frustrated, convinced I was onto something important but unable to make anyone take me seriously. My brother called that evening to check on me after hearing about Mrs. Portman's death through the neighborhood gossip network. He asked if I was okay, and I told him about my investigation into the license plates, about the patterns I'd found. He was silent for a long moment and then said gently that maybe this tragedy had triggered something in me, that I was using my obsession as a coping mechanism instead of processing the trauma of finding our neighbor dead. He suggested I talk to a therapist, that my fixation on the plates was probably making it harder for me to deal with what I'd witnessed. His concern felt like condescension, another person telling me my observations were symptoms of dysfunction rather than legitimate insights. I told him I was fine and ended the call, then went back to my analysis with renewed determination to prove I wasn't crazy. I decided to physically visit the locations where I'd documented the fraudulent plates, see if I could identify any connections between the sites. The first address was a used car lot in North Philadelphia that had permanently closed 2 months ago, according to the faded signs on the fence. The property looked abandoned, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement, windows broken or boarded up. I photographed the building and checked my records, confirming that 2 vehicles with fraudulent plates had been documented here within days of the business closing. The second location was a small rental agency that looked legitimate, but had multiple negative reviews online mentioning discrepancies in paperwork and overcharges. I watched the office for an hour but saw nothing obviously suspicious, just normal customer transactions and employees going about routine business. The third location was a body shop in an industrial area that advertised custom work and modifications. The building was older, painted gray with barred windows and security cameras mounted at every corner. I parked across from the body shop and watched for 2 hours, photographing every vehicle that came and went. Around 3 p.m., a dark blue sedan pulled in, not the exact vehicle from my neighbor's street, but the same make and model. The driver was a man in his 40s wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit. He spoke with someone inside the shop, then drove the sedan into one of the work bays. I photographed the plate, Pennsylvania plate HGB 3921. When I checked my database later, I confirmed this plate was also fraudulent, using a format that had been phased out 3 years ago. I'd found the source. This body shop was creating fake plates, probably for vehicles involved in various criminal enterprises. But I still couldn't connect this operation to Mrs. Portman's murder. I spent that night going through every photograph I'd taken in the past year, searching for any appearance of vehicles connected to the body shop near Mrs. Portman's apartment or neighborhood. At 2 a.m., I found something that made my hands shake. 3 weeks before the murder, I'd photographed a vehicle parked on our street at 11:30 p.m., unusual enough that I'd noted it in my log. The plate was Pennsylvania HGB 3856, nearly identical to the plate I'd seen at the body shop that afternoon. The sequential numbering suggested these plates were being created in batches, using the same outdated format. The vehicle in my photograph was a white van, and in the image I could partially see the driver's side through the windshield. I'd zoomed in on the plate and accidentally captured the driver, a blurry figure but potentially identifiable. I enhanced the image as much as my phone software allowed and saw a man with dark hair, possibly the same person I'd photographed at the body shop that afternoon. I called Detective Chu at 2:47 a.m., probably waking him, and told him I had photographic evidence connecting the body shop to Mrs. Portman's murder. He answered groggily and asked if this could wait until morning. I said no, that I had proof someone using fraudulent plates from a criminal operation had been surveilling Mrs. Portman's address weeks before she was killed. Detective Chu told me to come to the station first thing in the morning with all my evidence, his tone suggesting he was finally taking me seriously, or at least wanted to evaluate what I had before dismissing it entirely. I couldn't sleep after that call, spent the remaining hours organizing my documentation, printing photographs, creating a timeline that showed the connections between the fraudulent plates, the body shop, and the surveillance of Mrs. Portman's address. I arrived at 7 a.m. with my laptop, notebooks, and phone containing all my photographs. I spent 2 hours walking him through my analysis, showing him the pattern of fraudulent plates, the connection to the body shop, and the photograph of the white van near Mrs. Portman's apartment. He listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking questions about my methodology and how I could be certain the plates were fraudulent, rather than just old registrations. I explained the state DMV systems in detail, showed him documentation proving when different formats had been phased out, demonstrated how the fraudulent plates violated multiple rules of the current registration algorithms. Detective Chu made several phone calls while I waited nervously in the interview room. When he returned, he said they'd already been investigating the body shop for unrelated reasons, tips about stolen vehicle parts and VIN fraud. But they hadn't connected it to Mrs. Portman's murder until now. He said my photograph of the white van was potentially significant because Mrs. Portman's jewelry and some cash were missing from her apartment, suggesting robbery as a motive. If someone had been surveilling her home to plan a burglary and she'd surprised them, that could explain the violence. Detective Chu asked if I'd be willing to go through a formal statement and potentially testify if the case went to trial. I said absolutely, that I wanted whoever killed her to face justice. He brought in another detective, a woman named Lieutenant Sharon Reeves who specialized in organized crime. She asked me to walk through my entire analysis again, taking detailed notes and occasionally stopping me to ask about specific photographs or data points. She seemed impressed by the scope of my database, said most surveillance operations didn't have this level of documentation. I explained that I'd been cataloging plates for 8 years, that my records covered most of the Philadelphia metropolitan area plus parts of New Jersey and Delaware. Lieutenant Reeves asked if I'd noticed any other patterns in criminal vehicle use, whether I'd documented vehicles near other crime scenes or suspicious locations. I told her I'd never thought to cross-reference my data with crime statistics, that I'd been focused purely on the patterns themselves rather than their criminal applications. She suggested that might be useful information moving forward, that my database could potentially help identify patterns in how criminals used vehicles to avoid detection. Over the next week, the police executed a warrant on the body shop and found extensive evidence of vehicle fraud, including equipment for creating counterfeit license plates and documentation linking the operation to organized theft rings. They arrested 4 people, including the owner, a man named Vincent Delacroix, who'd been running the scheme for 6 years. During interrogation, one of the employees gave up information about side jobs they'd done, including providing vehicles with clean-looking fake plates for people planning robberies or other crimes. They'd rented the white van to a man named Marcus Trenton who'd specifically asked for an unremarkable vehicle with plates that wouldn't attract attention. Marcus Trenton was a convicted burglar with a history of targeting elderly victims in their homes. He'd served 8 years in state prison for a 2008 home invasion that had left a 70-year-old woman hospitalized with a fractured skull. The parole board had released him 18 months ago, despite objections from prosecutors who argued he remained a danger to the community. Detective Chu brought me in to look at a photo lineup, and I identified Trenton as the man in my enhanced photograph from the white van. The police obtained a warrant for Trenton's arrest and found Mrs. Portman's jewelry in his apartment, along with detailed notes about her routine and schedule. He'd been planning the burglary for weeks, watching her movements, waiting for the right opportunity. On the night of the murder, he'd broken in thinking she was asleep, but she'd woken up and confronted him. In panic, he'd struck her with a lamp from her own living room, then fled with the jewelry and $340 in cash. The medical examiner confirmed that the lamp, which had been found in the kitchen still covered in blood, matched the pattern of Mrs. Portman's injuries. Trenton's fingerprints were on the lamp despite his attempt to wipe it clean. They also found trace evidence, fibers from Mrs. Portman's carpet in Trenton's vehicle, her DNA under his fingernails from where she'd scratched him during the struggle. The case against him was overwhelming once they'd identified him as a suspect, but without my license plate documentation connecting the white van to the body shop, they might never have focused on him at all. Detective Chu told me privately that they'd been investigating several other leads, including Mrs. Portman's financial records and distant relatives, looking for someone with a clear motive. They hadn't considered a random burglary because nothing had appeared forced on the apartment door, suggesting Mrs. Portman had opened it willingly, or the intruder had picked the lock with professional skill. Trenton was charged with first-degree murder, burglary, and receiving stolen property. The district attorney's office scheduled a preliminary hearing for 6 weeks out, and I was informed I'd be called as a witness to explain how I'd identified the fraudulent plates and tracked them to the body shop. My role in solving the case became public knowledge when a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer got hold of the arrest warrant documents and wrote a story about the unconventional investigative techniques that had led to Trenton's capture. The article described me as an amateur sleuth with an unusual hobby, which felt both validating and uncomfortable. Suddenly, people I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out, congratulating me on solving the murder, asking about my database and methodology. My old college roommate called and apologized for mocking my license plate obsession back when we'd lived together, said she wished she'd been more supportive. Ryan, my ex-boyfriend, sent a carefully worded email saying he was proud of me for using my skills to help others, though he didn't explicitly apologize for leaving me over the hobby he'd called a waste of time. The attention was overwhelming. Reporters started showing up at my apartment and my workplace, asking for interviews and photographs. My mall security supervisor was annoyed by the disruption until he realized the publicity might actually benefit the mall's image. Then he became supportive and gave me time off to deal with the media requests. My parents called for the first time in months, having seen the newspaper article. My mother cried on the phone, saying she was sorry for not understanding, for dismissing something I'd cared about deeply. My father asked detailed questions about my database and analysis methodology, the engineer in him finally engaging with my work now that it had proven valuable. We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation I'd had with them since dropping out of college 8 years ago. They offered to come visit, to see my apartment and my documentation system, to understand the work I'd been doing all these years. I said yes, that I'd like that, surprised by how much their acceptance meant even after years of feeling rejected and misunderstood. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in December. I arrived at the courthouse nervous, having never testified in a legal proceeding before. The district attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia Drummond, met with me beforehand to prepare my testimony. She explained that Trenton's defense attorney would likely try to discredit me, to portray my hobby as obsessive behavior that led to unreliable observations. She said I needed to remain calm, stick to the facts, and not let the defense attorney provoke me into emotional responses that would undermine my credibility. I asked what would happen if the judge didn't find my testimony convincing. Patricia said the case had other strong evidence, but my license plate analysis was crucial for establishing the timeline and connecting Trenton to the body shop operation that had provided him with the vehicle. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with the judge's bench elevated above everything else. Trenton sat at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit and restraints, looking smaller and more ordinary than I'd imagined a murderer would look. His attorney was a public defender named Robert Lansky, who looked tired and overwhelmed, probably managing too many cases simultaneously. When I was called to testify, I swore the oath and took the seat facing the courtroom. Patricia asked me to explain my background and my license plate documentation hobby. I described the 8 years of cataloging, the scope of my database, my ability to identify state patterns and spot fraudulent registrations. Patricia showed the court several examples of my photographs and documentation, establishing that I maintained detailed records with timestamps and location data. Then she asked me to explain how I'd identified the fraudulent plate on the white van and connected it to the body shop. I walked through my analysis, explaining the outdated Pennsylvania format, the sequential numbering that indicated batch creation, the photograph I'd taken 3 weeks before Mrs. Portman's murder showing the van on our street. Patricia asked if I could identify anyone in the courtroom who appeared in that photograph. I pointed to Trenton and said he was the driver captured in the image. The defense attorney objected, saying the photograph was too blurry to make a positive identification. The judge overruled the objection but noted that the reliability of the identification would be evaluated. Robert Lansky cross-examined me aggressively, asking about my mental health history, my failed college career, my obsessive documentation of license plates. He asked how many hours per week I spent on this hobby, whether I'd ever sought psychiatric treatment for obsessive-compulsive disorder, whether I'd been diagnosed with any conditions that might affect my perception or memory. I answered honestly that no, I'd never been formally diagnosed with anything, that I'd spent extensive time on the hobby because I found it meaningful, not because I was compelled by mental illness. He asked if I'd ever made mistakes in my identifications, if I'd ever documented a plate incorrectly. I said yes. Occasionally, I'd recorded wrong numbers if the photograph was unclear, but I always verified my data and corrected errors when I found them. He asked how I could be certain the man in the blurry photograph was his client. I explained that I'd compared the photograph to surveillance footage from the body shop showing Trenton in similar clothing entering a vehicle with sequential plate numbers, that the probability of two different people in similar circumstances using related fraudulent plates was statistically minimal. He argued that statistical probability wasn't the same as proof, that I was making assumptions based on pattern analysis rather than concrete evidence. Patricia objected, saying the defense was argumentative. The judge sustained the objection and told Lansky to move on. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Multiple witnesses testified, including Detective Chu explaining the investigation, the body shop employee who'd rented Trenton the van, and forensic experts discussing the physical evidence found in Trenton's apartment. The judge ruled that there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial and denied Trenton bail, citing his prior conviction and the severity of the charges. I felt relieved leaving the courthouse, the stress of testifying finally lifting. Detective Chu caught up with me in the hallway and said I'd done well on the stand, that my testimony had been credible despite the defense attorney's attempts to undermine it. He asked if I'd be willing to consult on other cases, said the department could use someone with my pattern recognition skills. I said I'd think about it, still processing everything that had happened over the past 2 months. The trial was scheduled for April, 5 months away. In the meantime, I continued working mall security while consulting part-time with the police on license plate analysis for unrelated cases. Lieutenant Reeves brought me several cold cases involving vehicle crimes, asking me to review evidence photographs and see if I could identify patterns investigators had missed. In one case, I identified a rental vehicle that had been used in 3 different armed robberies across 2 counties, a pattern nobody had noticed because the plates had been swapped between crimes. That information led to the arrest of a robbery ring and the recovery of over $80,000 in stolen property. My parents visited in February, driving down from Harrisburg to see my apartment and my documentation system. My mother was shocked by the sheer volume of notebooks and photographs, but she tried to be supportive, asking questions about my methodology and how I organized the data. My father, the engineer, was fascinated by the pattern analysis, suggesting ways I could digitize more of my records and create searchable databases that would make the information more accessible to law enforcement. We went to dinner at the restaurant where Mrs. Portman and I had occasionally eaten together, a small Italian place that served her favorite soup. I told my parents about our friendship, about how she'd been one of the few people who never mocked my hobby. My mother cried again, saying she was ashamed that a neighbor had shown me more acceptance than my own family had. I told her it was okay, that people couldn't understand something they hadn't experienced, but that now maybe they could start trying. We parted on better terms than we'd had in years, with promises to stay in better contact and plans for me to visit them over the summer. The validation from my family helped heal something I hadn't realized was still wounded, the sense that I'd disappointed them by not becoming the successful engineer they'd hoped for. The trial began on a Monday in April. The courtroom was more crowded this time, with reporters and court observers filling the public seating. Trenton had apparently rejected a plea deal that would have given him 25 years, choosing instead to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that he'd been framed by the body shop employees to protect themselves. His defense strategy seemed desperate, but I suppose he had nothing to lose by going to trial given the severity of the charges. Patricia Drummond presented a methodical case over 6 days of testimony. She called Mrs. Portman's neighbors, who described hearing sounds of struggle around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murder. She called forensic experts who explained the blood spatter patterns and the lamp that had been used as a weapon. She called the medical examiner who described Mrs. Portman's injuries in clinical detail that made several jurors wince. She called the body shop employee who'd rented the van to Trenton and who testified that Trenton had specifically requested a vehicle with plates that wouldn't attract police attention. She called Detective Chu, who walked through the investigation and how my license plate documentation had led them to identify Trenton as a suspect. When I was called to testify, I felt more prepared than I had at the preliminary hearing. I'd reviewed my notes extensively and had practiced explaining my methodology in clear, simple language that non-experts could understand. Patricia asked me to explain my hobby and my database to the jury. I described the 8 years of documentation, the patterns I'd identified, my ability to spot fraudulent plates. Several jurors took notes as I spoke. Patricia showed the jury my photographs of the white van with the fraudulent plate, the timeline showing when it had appeared on our street, the analysis connecting that plate to the body shop's batch creation system. She asked me to explain how I'd identified Trenton in the photograph. I described the enhancement process, the comparison to body shop surveillance footage, the distinctive features visible even in the blurry image. Patricia asked if I had any doubt that the man in the photograph was Trenton. I said no, that I was certain based on the visual match and the circumstantial evidence connecting him to the vehicle. The defense attorney, Robert Lansky, cross-examined me again, this time with a different strategy. Instead of attacking my mental health, he focused on the technical aspects of my identification. He asked if I was a trained forensic analyst or facial recognition expert. I said no, I was self-taught in pattern analysis but had no formal training in facial identification. He asked if I'd ever testified as an expert witness before this case. I said no. He asked how many people I'd positively identified from blurry photographs in my 8 years of documenting license plates. I said Trenton was the first. He suggested that my lack of experience meant my identification was unreliable, that I was essentially guessing based on limited information. Patricia objected, and the judge instructed the jury to consider my testimony in the context of all the evidence presented. Lansky moved on to questioning my motivation, asking if I'd been seeking attention or recognition by involving myself in the investigation. I said no, that I'd been trying to find justice for my neighbor who'd been killed in her own home. He asked if I'd been disappointed when the police initially dismissed my information. I said yes, but that I'd persisted because I knew the pattern analysis was valid. He suggested that my persistence was driven by ego, rather than genuine concern for Mrs. Portman. I told him that was wrong, that Mrs. Portman had been kind to me when few others were, and that finding her killer mattered to me personally. Patricia asked me on redirect if there was any other reason I'd gotten involved in the investigation. I said there wasn't, that I simply wanted her murderer caught, and that my documentation happened to contain relevant evidence. The trial continued for another 3 days. The body shop owner, Vincent Delacroix, testified in exchange for a reduced sentence on his fraud charges. He confirmed that Trenton had been a customer, that they'd provided him with the white van specifically for a burglary he'd been planning. He said Trenton had paid cash and hadn't given his real name, but surveillance footage and vehicle records proved the connection. Delacroix's testimony was damning, removing any doubt that Trenton had used the body shop's services. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Trenton had been trying to rebuild his life after prison, that he'd been working construction and attending counseling sessions. They tried to suggest that someone else might have killed Mrs. Portman and planted evidence in Trenton's apartment. But the physical evidence was too strong. His fingerprints on the murder weapon, her DNA under his fingernails, her jewelry hidden in his closet. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. Patricia described Mrs. Portman as a kind woman who'd lived a quiet life and deserved to die peacefully in her sleep years from now, not beaten to death in her kitchen by a violent criminal who saw her as nothing more than an opportunity for profit. She walked the jury through the timeline: Trenton's surveillance of Mrs. Portman's home, his acquisition of a vehicle with fraudulent plates from the body shop, his entry into her apartment late at night, the confrontation that led to her death. She emphasized that this wasn't a case of self-defense or accident, but a calculated burglary by a career criminal who'd killed to avoid being identified. She said my license plate documentation had provided the crucial link that identified Trenton when he thought he'd been clever enough to avoid detection. She asked the jury to find him guilty on all counts, and to give Mrs. Portman's memory the justice she deserved. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. Lansky argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a self-taught pattern analyst with no formal credentials. He said the blurry photograph couldn't definitively prove Trenton was the driver of the white van. He said the body shop employee had motivation to lie to secure a plea deal on his own charges. He said someone else could have stolen Mrs. Portman's jewelry and planted it in Trenton's apartment to frame him. The arguments felt weak against the weight of evidence, but Lansky was doing his job defending a client who couldn't afford a private attorney and who faced spending the rest of his life in prison. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I waited in the courthouse cafeteria with Detective Chu and Lieutenant Reeves, drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if the verdict came back not guilty. Detective Chu tried to reassure me that the case was solid, that the jury would see through the defense's arguments. But I couldn't stop imagining Trenton walking free, Mrs. Portman's murder unsolved, my 8 years of documentation meaning nothing. When the bailiff called us back to the courtroom, I felt physically sick with anxiety. The jury filed in looking serious and tired. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses, said they had. She handed the verdict forms to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Judge Thomas Guerrero reviewed the forms and asked the defendant to stand. Trenton stood with his attorney, his expression blank but his hands shaking slightly. The judge asked the jury foreperson to read the verdict. She said, "On the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of burglary, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of receiving stolen property, we find the defendant guilty." Trenton showed no reaction, but his attorney put a hand on his shoulder, probably offering some standard reassurance about appeals. Patricia Drummond nodded in satisfaction. Detective Chu squeezed my shoulder and said, Justice for Mrs. Portman. I felt overwhelming relief mixed with sadness that this verdict couldn't bring her back, couldn't undo her final moments of terror. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later. Pennsylvania law required life imprisonment without parole for first-degree murder convictions, so the outcome was predetermined, but the formal sentencing would give Mrs. Portman's family an opportunity to provide victim impact statements. Her cousins contacted me after the verdict, thanking me for my role in the investigation. They said it helped to know someone had cared enough about their relative to pursue justice so persistently. They invited me to speak at the sentencing hearing if I wanted to address the court. I agreed, feeling I owed Mrs. Portman that much. The sentencing hearing was less formal than the trial. Judge Guerrero heard statements from Mrs. Portman's cousins describing her life, her career as a librarian, her kindness to strangers, the hole her death had left in their small family. They described finding out she'd been murdered, the horror of losing her to violence when she'd always been so gentle and peaceful. One cousin broke down crying while reading her statement, unable to continue. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium and addressed the court. I said that Mrs. Portman had been more than just a neighbor to me, that she'd been one of the few people who treated my interests with respect instead of mockery. I said that finding her on that October morning had been traumatic, but that using my documentation to help identify her killer had given meaning to years of work that most people had dismissed as worthless. I said I hoped the life sentence would give her family some measure of closure, though nothing could truly compensate for what had been taken from them. Judge Guerrero thanked me and then addressed Trenton directly. He said that Trenton had shown no remorse for his actions, no recognition of the life he'd destroyed. He said that Mrs. Portman had been 73 years old and vulnerable, and that targeting her showed depravity and cowardice. He sentenced Trenton to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus consecutive sentences for the burglary and stolen property charges. Trenton was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face finally showing emotion, a mix of anger and resignation. After the sentencing, I met with Patricia Drummond and Lieutenant Reeves. They said the police department wanted to formalize my consulting arrangement, offer me a paid position analyzing license plate patterns for auto theft and other vehicle-related crimes. The salary wasn't substantial, but combined with part-time security work, it would be enough to live on comfortably. I accepted immediately, excited to have legitimate work doing something I'd spent years developing expertise in. Lieutenant Reeves said they'd also like me to develop training materials for traffic enforcement officers, teaching them how to identify fraudulent plates and recognize patterns that indicated criminal vehicle use. Over the next 6 months, my life changed dramatically. I quit the mall security job and focused full-time on license plate analysis for the police department. I consulted on 16 cases, identifying fraudulent plates used in robberies, assaults, and 1 attempted murder. My database helped recover 18 stolen vehicles and dismantle 3 vehicle fraud operations, similar to the body shop that had supplied Trenton. The work was satisfying in ways I'd never experienced before, using my obsessive pattern documentation to actually help people, to prevent crimes and catch criminals. I started a blog about license plate analysis that gained a following among law enforcement professionals and auto enthusiasts. People sent me photographs from across the country asking me to analyze whether plates were legitimate, and I'd break down the patterns that indicated fraud. The state police offered me a consultant position working with their auto theft task force, which meant regular income and benefits for the first time since college. I moved into a better apartment, still documenting license plates, but now with professional purpose. My relationship with my family continued to improve. My parents visited regularly, and my brother admitted he'd been wrong to suggest I needed therapy for my hobby. Ryan reached out again, this time suggesting we meet for coffee to catch up. I agreed, curious what he wanted after 3 years of no contact. He apologized for leaving me the way he had, said he'd been young and hadn't understood that different people found meaning in different things. He said seeing what I'd accomplished with my license plate analysis had made him realize he'd been unfair. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that our relationship had ended for reasons beyond just the hobby, that we'd wanted different things from life and that was okay. We parted amicably, both of us acknowledging that some connections aren't meant to last but can still matter during the time they exist. I attended a memorial service for Mrs. Portman on the 1-year anniversary of her death. Her cousins had arranged a gathering at the library where she'd worked, inviting colleagues and friends to share memories. I spoke about her kindness, her willingness to understand my unusual interest, her impact on my life. After the service, one of her cousins gave me a box of her belongings they thought I might want. Inside were several books about pattern recognition and cryptography that she'd apparently been reading to better understand my hobby. Finding those books broke something open in me. She'd cared enough to educate herself about my interest, to find common ground with someone most people dismissed. I cried holding those books, grieving not just her death but all the conversations we'd never have, all the times I'd taken her kindness for granted. The guilt of finding her body that October morning never fully faded, but knowing her killer was imprisoned for life provided closure. Knowing my obsessive documentation had been crucial to that, justice gave meaning to years of work I'd thought was pointless. 3 years after Mrs. Portman's murder, I've consulted on 43 criminal cases, identified 62 fraudulent plates used in serious crimes, and helped recover 31 stolen vehicles. My database contains over 340,000 documented plates across 7 states. I'm teaching workshops for law enforcement about identifying fraudulent registrations and recognizing patterns in criminal vehicle use. The police academy invited me to give a guest lecture about the intersection of citizen observation and criminal investigation. My parents attended the lecture and told me afterward they were proud of the work I was doing, that they were sorry they hadn't understood sooner. I've started dating someone I met at a law enforcement conference, another analyst who understands obsessive dedication to pattern recognition. We compare notes about unusual cases and share techniques for data organization. He doesn't think my hobby is weird, sees it as valuable expertise that benefits the community. I solved my neighbor's murder because I'd spent 8 years memorizing license plate patterns that everyone told me was a waste of time. The hobby that cost me relationships and opportunities and normal social integration turned out to be exactly what was needed to identify a killer who thought he'd been clever enough to avoid detection. Marcus Trenton is serving life in prison without parole. The body shop fraud network has been dismantled, and Mrs. Portman's family has the closure of knowing justice was served. That's worth every hour I spent in parking lots with my camera, every notebook filled with sequential registration numbers, every dismissive comment about my obsession. The pattern was always there, waiting for someone who cared enough to see it. And when it mattered most, when a kind woman's life had been taken by violence, my 8 years of compulsive documentation became the key that unlocked the truth. I keep Mrs. Portman's photograph on my desk as a reminder that seemingly meaningless obsessions can save lives, that the skills society dismisses might be exactly what's needed when crisis strikes, and that kindness to strange neighbors creates connections that transcend death. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.